I want to conclude this course with a few more examples of exposure control that I hope will help you achieve the results that you want with Reality and Lux. While we have already seen in the first two lessons what the exposure controls do, let's try some more experiments to see those controls in action and how you work with them. If you've been playing around with exposures, you may have found that different combinations of settings can lead to the same results. So how do you know which settings are the right ones? Why would you prefer one combination of settings over another? Who cares what the numbers are as long as the results look good? Well, there are subtle but important differences, and it's a good thing to spend some more time learning about this subject. It will pay off in the future. If we had experiences using real film stock, for example, we would not dial a film speed of 4000 in lux easily because the value is much beyond the maximum speed of real film. So why is Lux providing it? Modern high-end digital cameras provide that kind of flexibility because they can simply pump more electricity into the digital sensor, therefore amplifying the signal. Then they use some very smart filters to reduce the noise to levels that were simply unattainable with film. This is with high-end digital single-lens reflex cameras. The typical point-and-shoot camera is still delivering some high amounts of digital noise when using high ISO values. So if you are a photographer, you would keep the ISO settings at the lowest possible because noise can potentially be there. The past experience would keep you on your toes, and that's a good thing because there are ways of getting the right result with just a minimum amount of cheating. So a setting, for example, of 1600 ISO will be used only if nothing else can be done, like when shooting night scenes with only street illumination available. The reason is simple. The photographic language has evolved over the past decades around the limitations of the medium. Suddenly subverting the rules of the game might not lead to good realism. You might be tempted to dismiss this as dinosaur age nonsense, and in part, you will be right. Artificial rules should not keep the artist from experimenting. That is true. But arbitrarily throwing numbers around is not going to help either. There is a look that we are used to. There is a certain way things look, and breaking the laws of physics can introduce subtle inaccuracies that will break the realism of your images. So let's start with a sun-based scene and see what we can do with that. By default, if we use the sun, Lux sets the tone mapper, what we see here, to Reinhardt, which is an automatic way of setting the exposure. You might think that this is great, but it isn't. Don't let a machine make artistic decisions for you. Machines are not artists, and controlling the exposure is an artistic tool, not a technical chore. So in this lesson, you will learn more about exposure so that you can control it the way you want. So we switch to the linear tone mapper, which is the only tone mapper that I use, and suddenly our image is gone. This is because the linear tone mapper settings have not been set correctly yet. When we switch to the linear tone mapper, the default values were called, but those values have nothing to do with the scene. No problem, because now you'll learn some tips on how to change those tone mapper settings from the defaults so that they work perfectly with your scene. Until you gain some practice, try to keep things simple. The way of achieving this is to learn from my people, the Romans. Divide and conquer. In this case, the tone mapper has 3 parameters: film speed, shutter, and f-stop. Don't try to approach all these 3 parameters at the same time. Create a situation when you change one at a time. This is how we do it. We start with the film speed. Because this is a daylight scene, we want the film to be fairly slow. Remember what we mentioned before. There is so much light coming from all around us, not just one spot, that the film can be easily overloaded. So select a film speed that is quite low, 50, 64 or 100 at the max. This scene has the sun up in the sky, so let's use ISO 50. Now the film speed is pinned. Next, we're going to skip the shutter for now and tackle the aperture or f-stop instead. Try to memorize the following range. f2.8 is wide open iris and f22 is pretty much closed iris. Giving that neat piece of knowledge, let's select something in the middle like f8. The aperture now is pinned as well. Good. Now that the film speed and aperture are blocked, we can experiment with the last parameter, the shutter speed. Divide and conquer. We have singled out the shutter speed as the only variable parameter. Now we can move it around until we find something that is close to the result that we want. Let's see. Will 1/125th of a second be enough? No. The image is still very overexposed, but let's pay attention to the HDR histogram to the left, right here. And we can see that there has been a sudden change in the highlight area. Where there was nothing before, now we see some values. This is nothing that we can use, but it shows that internally, where Lux keeps the light information using the full light spectrum, things are better. So it's encouraging. The tone-mapped or RGB version of the image is still unusable, but we are indeed making progress. Okay, let's go to the next step. 1/250th. No. Okay, 1/500th of a second should do it. Good. This is a correct exposure, but we said just a few minutes ago that the exposure is an artistic tool, not just a technical chore. What if I wanted to create a slightly overexposed look, something that conveys the idea of a scorching sun with the highlights just about to break, but not really? That's where things get easy though. Now that we have adjusted all the three parameters from their defaults to work with this scene, we are free to go back and tweak these parameters to get exactly the effect that we want. Think about it. What would be the right parameter to change? If we pick an f-stop lower than the current one, we know that we are going to double the amount of light. Each lower f-stop number brings double the light that we had before. That's a pretty coarse increment, but let's try it. At f5.6, the picture looks quite overexposed. Let's go back to f8. The shutter is also moving at large increments, so the film speed is what's left. We need a bit more light, but not too much. So we can try ISO 64. That looks good. Let's go even a bit further. Let's try ISO 80. Too much. Let's go back to 64. As a final touch, let's apply a film response. This function often softens the highlights a bit, so that areas that are mildly overexposed can actually get back within range because of the way film handles that part of the image. For this image, I will select the Max Zoom 800 CD film response. It increases the contrast in a nice way without being excessive. And it makes the color a bit warmer and more saturated. But there is still a part of the image that is overexposed at the top of the buildings. That is actually not too bad, but I'd like to do something about it. So we cheat. We shamelessly cheat because we can get away with it and we have a good reason for this. We want to make a better picture. We can actually take advantage of the fact that reality splits the sunlight into two groups, the sun and the sky. Let me show you the contribution of each light so that you can understand what part of the image they affect. We click on the Light Groups tab and then click on the Power button for the sun. That turns off the sunlight, and now we can see the picture with only the effect of the sky. This is a very nice effect by itself, and you could possibly use this and lower the exposure a bit and use it as a night light. Let's turn on the sun again and then turn off the skylight so that we can see the effect of the sun alone. Again, this is a great unique light that could be interesting for several situations. The point of this exercise, though, is to see that the contribution of the sun and the sky are quite separate. It's clear that the overexposure of the upper walls is caused by the direct sunlight. So let's lower the brightness of the sunlight while keeping the skylight the same. At 0.75, it looks good. Let's keep it in that way and declare this render finished. What? Do you think the photographers don't cheat? They do it all the time. They shoot in RAW format and then they load the picture in some programs like Apple Aperture or Adobe Lightroom and adjust the highlight and dark tones in ways that would not come naturally from the camera. As long as you don't completely subvert the laws of nature, this is well within the limits of fairness. There you go. That's how you adjust the exposure for a sunny day. More complex light setups work in the same way. Just keep an eye on the overall balance of light and check if there are areas that are overexposed or underexposed. If that happens and you can't adjust the exposure correctly, you might have a light balance issue. And in that case, it might be helpful to go back to your scene and add a light here and there to shift that balance. Besides the tips in this video tutorial, you have to practice, practice, practice. Don't just create a scene, push the render button and let it go. Set the frame to be small, do a quick test and adjust, experiment and see how the software reacts. Having a fast turnaround for small experiments is a good way of mastering the art of rendering. Stay motivated, and with a bit of practice, you will be handling correct exposure without any problem. You've learned a lot of tips and techniques in these lessons. Now you are ready to go and make your own reality.